Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
So our topic today is mistletoe, mishaps, and mandatory fun at work. Chris, what are we going to talk about today?
All right, Ben, we're going to talk about holiday parties and other office social events gone wild.
Oh, gosh.
And office romance, fraternization, harassment, and a better way forward. And mandatory fun, which is you will go to this event that's social. And how to approach these events as an organization or leader.
Awesome. Wow. That's going to be a fun one. So why don't we start with the whole holiday parties and other office social events gone wild. And maybe we could just start with, some examples from our own experiences. So I know you have a couple, right?
Yeah. So, as a consultant and somebody that's in a lot of different organizations, you end up going to, I don't know, some of them are really good, but you end up going to probably more than of these in a season than you should. So and normally it's always been when booze has been involved. So, I don't know. I was at this one Christmas party where this guy got really angry drunk, and he walked outside of this pub that was hosting the event and punched a homeless guy.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It was you have no context for it, So this guy is homeless and, that's not a really good spot. But this guy walked out in front of the boss and everybody. And let's just say it wasn't a good outcome for him afterwards. But
Yikes.
What about you, Ben?
Well, so interestingly, and probably not coincidentally, the ones that come to mind immediately for me also involve alcohol. Seems to be a common denominator in some of the mishaps part of these social events at work. And, I remember one kind of a formal dinner type thing that we had where there was a reception kind of beforehand, like a cocktail hour before the dinner. And it was open bar. And someone decided, which was fine, I guess, but then one person decided that they were gonna, basically take a couple bottles of the booze from behind the bar and then bring them into the formal dinner and that kind of stuff. And some people got a little upset about that and so forth. And then just various other things where people have maybe drank too much and then said inappropriate things, or maybe were overly informal with each other or with the boss. And it's just, it gets yucky. And, it's one of these things where it's an event that's supposed to be great. It's supposed to be fun and so forth. And parts of it are and so forth. But, the outcome can be kind of, counterproductive in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because it's almost trite to even say Christmas parties, booze, career limiting shenanigans, right? That almost, that's almost E equals MC square of Christmas parties.
Right. It is. And, in addition to these events, these parties where people maybe are behaving badly or you have some sort of incident, there are plenty of events like this that are just lame. They're just not fun. It's something that the organization sets up or the leader sets up. No one really wants to go, but they really feel obligated to go. They feel like they have to show their face and so forth. And, so that's another thing that I think we need to address.
Yeah, maybe people drink because the party's so lame.
Maybe they do. They're just like, I want to forget, how bad this party is. Perhaps
inner child crying out for some entertainment.
Yeah, and then they create their own entertainment.
Right.
So that's one theory. Absolutely. Okay, so obviously, I think everybody who's been around the workplace for a long time probably has lots of examples of these, and it's not hard to think of them. And it's not to say that there's no place for holiday parties or social events at work. sometimes these can be really great and can be really fun. But there are some potential pitfalls. So why don't we, just go through from our experience, from our observations, some of those pitfalls for leaders, some of those pitfalls for organizations that can come with the whole idea of setting up a holiday party or other types of social events for your people.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting and that's newish in the HR world is, checking out applicants' social media. You know, okay, this guy seemed really good, and then you go on his Facebook and you find out that he's in like really reprehensible organizations, or that person is, just conducting themselves in a way that wouldn't reflect well on the company, and so you don't move ahead with that candidate. Well, what's
Hmm.
so interesting is, how you behave when you're under the influence of alcohol. If it's bad, it represents how you behave away from work. So if I see somebody at a Christmas event or something like that, and they are ripped and they are not funny, haha, but actually really bad, that probably on the weekend somewhere they're getting ripped and acting badly in a way that reflects poorly or would reflect poorly on the company. So
Hmm.
hey, don't do it. So if you know that you're a not so good boozer, that's uh, don't be a boozer at your holiday event.
Right, right. Yeah, the key here is to know your limits. Don't embarrass yourself with alcohol, and remember that people are noticing. Right, this is still a work event, and you still
Right.
have work people around you, and so forth. So, and like you mentioned, how you act in those situations very could well represent how you act away from work as well.
Right.
You know,
Right.
another yeah, and another part of this is as an organization, you want to think carefully about these types of events so that you're not creating some sort of situation that puts the organization in some big risk, legal or otherwise. And I'm thinking like, don't do stuff like have a big party that's somewhere kind of remote where it's people definitely have to drive themselves there, and you have open bar and alcohol is this huge thing, and then expect everybody to, get in their cars and drive home, right? You want to think those types of things through. And, you want to make sure that you have, well before any kind of social event like this, you want to make sure you have good policies and understandings in place regarding some of the stuff we'll talk about here in a little while, things such as fraternization and sexual harassment and stuff like that.
Right. And especially if you're a big organization, those same access issues for Americans with disabilities and other things should apply to the a venue that you're going to.
Right. You don't want to make these types of things events that exclude people. And, sometimes leaders will, when they're coming up with ideas about some sort of social event for other people, they will very naturally think about things that they think are fun and things that they enjoy doing. But that very well might not be something that more broadly applies across the organization, especially if you have a highly diverse workforce.
Yeah, I always call those fishing rod gifts. The husband gifts their wife a fishing rod because that's just what she always wanted, which if she does, that's great. But,
Yeah.
make sure it's something that the group really wants.
Right, right. Because every wife actually wants a Peloton.
That's right.
So yeah,
I saw
exactly.
that on TV.
Exactly. Yeah. So another thing that I think is important is that organizations and leaders need to realize that they shouldn't be forcing these types of events upon people. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but what we call this, I don't know if this is a military only phrase, but it's definitely, that's the first place that I came across this phrase, but the idea of mandatory fun. You know,
Right.
um, is that common in the army as well?
Well, it's hard for me to say because pretty much everybody in my extended family's in the military.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's a military family barrier in my life.
Yeah, so your mandatory fun was at home as well.
Yeah, they said, all right, mandatory family fun time.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is that a lot of times that mandatory fun isn't fun. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. So that's another pitfall. You don't want to force those events upon people. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is, you can't make these after work activities mandatory, really, especially for people who are on an hourly wage scale. You can't make them mandatory unless people are on the clock, right? That can be a tricky thing HR wise, because basically you're requiring them to be at work, because this event is an extension of the workplace in a way, and so you can't make them do this stuff in an unpaid status, so to speak. So you got to be careful about that too.
Right. And working parents have schedules,
Yeah.
and it's not, they can't tell the daycare, "Hey, just tack on another 2 hours,"
Hmm.
and that creates a burden for some people. And I know in some organizations they say, "Well, Steve wasn't at the party. I don't know if Steve's a team player."
Right.
Well, Steve may be a single parent that doesn't have another option. So you need to make sure that as leaders that you're aware of those kinds of situations.
Yeah, yeah, or maybe that person has an elder parent that they're taking care of, and they can't leave them alone. All those kinds of things are really important, and a lot of times people can make these false attributions about why someone's maybe not there. It could be a whole host of reasons, including that they just have other things that they have to do related to their family life. So definitely keep that in mind.
Right. Now let's talk about power status differentials.
Oh
So,
gosh.
um, at these events is normally a time for socialization between different levels of management and, um, I don't know regular workers,
Hmm.
subject matter experts, so, the software developer all the way to the CEO.
Right.
And normally there wouldn't be that much exposure throughout a business day. You may see the CEO for a quarterly meeting or something. But here you're in there is a costume change here. And it can feel like you're not at work anymore. You've taken your tie off, or, you've put on a ugly Christmas sweater, right? And it starts to feel more frenzy, right?
Hmm.
The relationship feels more colloquial. And don't fall for that trick. That the hierarchy still exists, and those managers and executives are still have their thinking and judging caps on.
Mhm.
So make sure that you're minding your P's and Q's, and this could be an excellent time to highlight maybe a little bit of your hobbies, your who you are outside of work, but make sure that that's filtered in a work appropriate way.
Exactly. So you have to exercise some really good judgment there. And there's a lot of pitfalls there if you are kind of deceived by the context, the costume change, so to speak, and you start acting in a too friendly manner with everyone around you. I think it is important to note that there is benefit to getting to know people kind of in a different context, and learn more about who they really are and so forth. There are huge benefits to that. So we don't want to discount that and say that that's all bad. But this is one of those things that is, there's kind of a paradox here where you need to know where that line is and just tread carefully, regardless of whether or not you are the subordinate, so to speak, in this situation, or if you are the more senior level person. I've seen in some of these situations where a senior level person will see this as an opportunity to, make friends with everybody and show how cool they are. And I think that that's very problematic as well.
Right. And I just feel the need to say this because despite there being so many internet articles, LinkedIn will always have something, right? I just see it all the time. So if you're a line level employee, I see, shenanigan behavior. And then same thing, if you're just stepped up into a director role and you're just now being weighted as an executive, and you flush your executive presence
Hmm.
in front of the other executives, that's just not good. You still need to maintain some decorum.
Absolutely. And, I think we've already mentioned this, but just acting crazy or becoming the story the next day at some sort of company event, this can certainly be a career limiting decision. If you walk into that party and everyone really respects you and thinks highly of you and thinks you're competent. And then you make some decisions about, getting on the dance floor a little too early or acting a little too crazy or maybe doing something even worse. People will start to see you much differently, and that can carry over back into the actual workplace.
Right. And even in organizations where it's a little bit loose, like sales organizations, they're used to wining and dining clients.
Hmm.
But, I saw a guy, having so much fun by himself on the dance floor. He took off his shirt and was dancing with
Oh,
himself.
no.
And so all the emails he's getting the next day are that 80s song Dancing with Myself and I mean, he actually survived. He was
Really?
young. Some of the older sales guys said, "Listen, man, this thank you for making it the best Christmas party ever, but we can't recommend this way."
Oh gosh, that's just so funny. I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah,
gosh.
and I think the a thing here, we're kind of talking about these power and status differentials. Be wary of those interactions across power levels. If the CEO is at the party, by all means, like go over, say hi. Be polite. Introduce. Your maybe if you have a plus one at the party, introduce that person to the CEO and, make some small talk, maybe mention a couple other things, say thanks for the party, but know, kind of when to step out and don't, if it's not the culture in your organization, don't be overly informal with that person. So a lot of this does kind of come back, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, comes back to these cultural norms about what is appropriate in your organization versus some other organizations. So there are certain things that you might do at a party in the civilian world, for example, that you would not do at a party in the military. So keeping that in mind is very important.
Yeah, and if you're an executive or management, this could be a good time to just introduce yourself to some people.
Hmm.
Hey, accounting person, I'm so and so that sends you emails monthly. Nice to finally meet you. Thanks for a good year. Those are times where you can get kind of put a face with a name type item. Those can be really good, but chilling out across those power levels, you just need to be aware of what your perception of authority would be afterwards. Make sure
Right.
you're professional.
And sometimes it might be the case where, let's say a certain kind of level of employees are huddling together and talking and stuff, and that's very natural. And then the boss comes over and starts talking with them as well. They probably don't want you there for too long anyway. You know,
Yeah, they
go
need some time to be like, well, this guy stinks.
yeah, and so just be mindful of that. Like, don't think that everybody wants to hear your jokes and everything. Go say hi, hang out with them for a few minutes, then go out on a high note and walk away. Same thing if you're in a lower level person in the organization. If you see a group of directors or VPs or whatever, by all means, you can say hi and so forth, but they probably don't want you to like hang around them the entire night either. So remember that these types of things, this hierarchy and so forth, does still exist in this environment, even though the context has changed.
You got it. And that brings me to another thing, Ben. I think Christmas parties are a great time to finally make a romantic move on that person you've been thinking about all year.
Okay. Yeah. Um, Probably not,
Right.
It's oh gosh, but you do see that. I mean, that's like probably one of the more common horror stories in one of the mishaps that happens at these types of things. It's the booze and the mistletoe and whatever, and
Some of
then
those ugly sweaters are irresistible. So
well, that definitely is true. Absolutely, yeah.
So
Wow.
let's talk about romance and the term fraternization, since I see that happen at these Christmas parties all the time, and now we might as well talk about it. So
Yes, yes, let's do that. So, I think fraternization is a term that is kind of pounded into us, at least in the Navy, from a very early on stage, whenever you're, even before I was actually commissioned as an officer, like, knowing what that is and so forth. And so, but I don't know if it's quite as common of a term that's, thought about in the civilian world, although I have seen it many times in some HR policies and so forth. But basically, this is an unduly friendly relationship or unduly familiar relationship between across those different levels, right? So
Right.
this doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could just be like, I'm really good friends and I talk and I joke around all the time with this one really junior person. And the reason that that's difficult and can create some big issues is it can create some um, issues of either real or perceived favoritism within the organization. And that can just be a real culture killer, and can lead to a whole host of things that are unproductive.
Yeah, and especially if you're trying to build a culture of meritocracy. We've
Yeah.
all been in organizations where, hey, this junior person has the CEO's favor on them,
Hmm.
right? And that one, we can tell that Billy's being groomed for the top slot, even though Billy's 18, it just started. But that being said, there can be especially if you have formalized process around junior employees and senior employees. That kind of cross generational stuff can be good, but if
Hmm.
it's overly chummy and starts to dip into that fraternization, side, that's not good. Which means,
Right.
Ben, should people have formalized processes around this stuff?
There should be some policies, some procedures, other types of things that HR should have spelled out for the organization. Some, policies that talk about what fraternization is, and how it should be prevented and so forth. Should also have uh, some policies that relate to office romance, right? And the tricky thing here is that a fairly decent sized chunk of the population actually does meet their romantic partners and even their maybe long lifelong spouses and so forth at work. Like that's the tricky thing. It does happen, right?
Well, yeah, because with the hours you hit, it's not like you have gobs and gobs and hours to pursue a whole lot, depending on your career field, right? So,
Right.
Monster.com did a big survey. What is it? Monster Worldwide Inc. But they asked
Hmm.
visitors to their site, do you think a dating a colleague would harm your career prospects, and would you do it? And they got 5,100 responses internationally. So 39% of respondents answered yes, harmful, and I would never date a colleague.
Hmm.
19% of people said yes, harmful, but I would date a colleague anyway. The,
Go for it.
the 19, maybe that was the dancing with himself guy, right?
Yeah.
Some of those answer there. 15% of respondents said not harmful, but I would never date a colleague.
Hmm.
And 27% said not harmful and I would date a colleague.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a mix there of people's views, but what that says is that you got to have policies because a bunch of different people will have different thoughts about how this should play out in the workplace.
Right, right. And if as an HR department or as an organization you say we're just going to forbid this, good luck. Like it's got you can go ahead and do it. It's going to happen anyway. What's important instead is to have some definitions around, what should happen if it happens. For example, let's say a manager and one of his or her people develop some sort of romantic relationship. Well, that needs to be disclosed, and that person can't be reporting to his or her romantic partner anymore, like that, because that just creates another set of issues around favoritism and so forth, especially if that person is evaluating that person's performance, right? So
Yeah.
that's a very typical thing.
Yeah. And don't wait for shenanigans to go down before you make your policies.
Right.
Ye Because then it's oh, yeah, that's the Bill policy. Remember when Bill,
Yeah. That's the dancing with myself policy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ex Shoot.
thou shalt not take off your shirt and dance by yourself at the party. Right. And I mean, the stuff is, it is important to have it in place beforehand. Like, that's the key here, because otherwise it does become, perception is that it's a knee-jerk reaction to something that happened. And so be proactive about this, not reactive about it. That's the key here.
Right. So Ben, let's bring us to the darker side of this. So rather than like a bad, hey Sandra, would you like to go to lunch? No, Bill, don't ask me ever again. Okay, right. But actually, and this is really needful in this time to talk a little bit about sexual harassment. So
Right. And we're going to talk about it, I think, a little bit more generally, but we're talking about it within the context of these social events, because a lot of times the mishaps that happen at these social events, be it a holiday party or something else, can involve some sort of sexual harassment. It's kind of this cocktail of, a social event, alcohol, and sexual harassment. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of some types and categories and so forth to help people understand exactly what it is. But I think the big picture here, and a big thing that we're trying to do with this podcast and with all of our work, really, is to promote human flourishing at work. And great organizations help everyone flourish at work. And from that perspective, sexual harassment is a major impediment to flourishing at work. And it's illegal.
And it's horrible.
Right.
I mean, it's not the way that we need to be moving forward as people on this planet.
Right, exactly. So sexual harassment involves both words and actions. It can be across any combination of genders. It's not just the men who are doing this to women, even though, oftentimes that's what we hear about. It can really be in any combination. And one of the better definitions of sexual harassment actually comes from a book that I use for my graduate level HR class that I teach. And the book is called The Manager's Guide to HR by Max Muller. And he's an attorney, so it can be a fairly risk heavy type of read, but it's good. But what he talks about sexual harassment, he defines it as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So there's a lot that goes into this.
Right. And yeah. So Ben, let's just dive into the categories. So
Sure.
There's basically two general categories. The first one's quid pro quo, or
Yes.
quid pro quo. What is that?
So quid pro quo is this for that. And this is where the harasser has some sort of authority. They have the ability to reward or punish in some way. And they use that authority to try to obtain some sort of sexual favor, right? Be it you get this promotion if you go out on this date with me, that kind of stuff. And the key here from an employer standpoint is to remember that the employer is liable for actions of supervisors, those people who have authority, because supervisors are considered an agent of the organization. So that's the quid pro quo stuff, and it's actually relatively straightforward in terms of what it is, because it's a conditional thing, this for that. The other category, though, which is actually broader, is called hostile work environment. And so this is when a person or persons are creating a situation at work that's hostile, intimidating, or offensive, and it negatively affects someone's ability to do his or her job through words or actions of a sexual nature. So it has to be something of a sexual nature. It has to be something that a reasonable person would see as unwelcomed, and it also needs to negatively affect people's ability to do their job. So you can kind of see that this can be a much broader range of activities, and there's much more subjectivity in terms of what it is. Because basically the legal standard is it's the reasonable person standard.
Right.
So it can be somewhat more difficult to prove than a quid pro quo case, but it's definitely a big part of sexual harassment overall.
All right. And also just think as a individual, no matter where you're at in the organization, what do you want your personal brand to be? And I'm
Yeah.
specifically thinking around items that might be, I don't know, that seems like a dated generational term, but locker room talk.
Mm,
Um, the way you conduct yourself when people are losing their minds a little bit and the way they're talking about stuff, which, a lot of it may just be puffery and baloney, but don't let that stuff, that kind of dialogue sully your personal brand, really.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's very important. And things that may have been considered acceptable or were tolerated in years past in the workplace, oftentimes are not acceptable today. And so that's where some people can get themselves into trouble by thinking that the standards are the same, when in fact, societal norms have changed in a lot of ways related to all of this
It
this material.
changed for the better, in my view.
Right,
So,
right.
exactly.
Yeah. So, I think we could talk a little bit now about what some things that employers should do to try to mitigate this risk of sexual harassment, to try to get ahead of this, and again, do this kind of stuff before it actually happens.
Right. And if you don't have a policy on sexual harassment and hostile work environment and those kinds of items, you need to get with SHRM, which we'll put a link to in the show notes.
Hmm.
Ben, what is SHRM?
So SHRM is the Society for Human Resource Management. So it's the largest professional organization for HR professionals. And if you're a member, you can easily get a template for this kind of stuff and then customize it to fit your organization. Your HR people better be familiar with that kind of stuff. Otherwise, you need new HR people. But have that policy and complaint procedure. Make sure people have a copy of it, right? You can also make sure that policy and procedure is incorporated into your other documents that you have. So, for example, you should have some sort of employee handbook, but that's not enough. Like, don't just stick it in a binder or something and say, oh, well, we have a policy, right? You need to also follow that up with providing some training, posting it somewhere that's visible, redistribute it as necessary, retrain periodically, so that you keep this fresh in people's minds, as well as have this be part of your orientation process, so that people new who are coming into the organization know what is expected, know what is not expected, and can be aligned right from day one.
Yeah, and a big thing about policies, and this goes from everything from IT security all the way down to um, your fraternization policy, that these have to be living, breathing documents that are updated. So if there's
Mm.
something that goes on and you go to court and they're like, well, let's see your manual, and it has the date 1965 on it, right? Doesn't look so good for you. And the thing is, these policies document what is a living action within the organization. So, if you have an IT policy, one of the big parts that is part of audits now and should be a part of your internal audit for your organization is, okay, here's the policy. Now tell me, how are you validating that that's being checked up on and living within the organization?
Wow. Yeah, that's a part that I think a lot of organizations miss.
Right. And I mentioned SHRM because I continually run into some of these smaller organizations that we do work for. And, you know, they just have somebody that, okay, you're interested in HR. Well, here. And, that is a professional community that you should be plugging into if you're a lone HR operator within a smaller organization.
Yes, yes, that's definitely the case. And it's also important to make sure that these policies and procedures are well constructed. You should, with regard to sexual harassment, clearly explain what is prohibited. So have something clear in there about fraternization, about romantic relationships, about what sexual harassment is. And you could consider including in that some explanations of the four big types. So the way I kind of think of sexual harassment is there's these two categories: one, quid pro quo; two, hostile work environment. But then there are kind of four big types of sexual harassment. And the first one is verbal sexual harassment. So this is when people make suggestive comments or propositions, jokes, that kind of stuff. Then there's physical sexual harassment, which would be actual assault, sexual gestures, inappropriate touching, the being handsy, that kind of stuff. visual sexual harassment, inappropriate images, videos, and this is, regardless of how it's distributed. So, a lot of this happens via mobile technology nowadays. So, regardless of how it's distributed, it can be considered sexual harassment. And then sexual favors. So, this kind of falls into, um, or can fall into the quid pro quo category, but pressuring people for dates, unwanted advances of some sort, and conditioning some sort of employment benefit upon that exchange. So, have some explanations about those big types in your policy.
Right. And, this is something you can have this policy, but if people don't have a means of reporting these incidents that protects them, you
Hmm.
might as well not have a policy.
Right. Right.
So you got to have a kind of harassment whistleblower protection, something that's meaningful and clearly describe how that complaint process
Hmm.
works.
Hmm.
So, and it can't be overly rigid. It has to be a workable thing for anybody because when this kind of behavior happens, people are worried about their job, how they'd be perceived by their coworkers, and those kinds of things. And then, what are some other best practices for the complaint process?
Right. So it should allow for some flexibility. Shouldn't be overly rigid. Like, you must talk to your supervisor first, right? Because your supervisor might be the one who's doing it. So it
Right.
should allow for some bypassing of the chain of command, so to speak. You also want to have some information in there about time frames. So, like, you can't wait 10 years and then claim that you were sexually harassed at the holiday party back in, you know, whatever. Uh, that's not going to work because there are statutes of limitations for filing these types of complaints. And generally, sooner is better. And there are some differences across different states and so forth. But I'll just say that to be safe, do it within 180 days. That's kind of a general rule of thumb here, and make sure that people are doing that in a timely manner. You also want to make sure that there's some protection of confidentiality to the extent possible, but you don't want in your policy to be guaranteeing people total confidentiality because that can really put you in a bind. There may be situations in which you need to share what happened with other parties. Uh, have a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation. So this is something that you can conduct internally. Sometimes organizations will bring in outside help to do that investigation, but make sure you do that in a prompt and thorough way, and make sure it's impartial. You don't want to, because people will and sometimes do make accusations that are not warranted. So you don't want to jump to conclusions about what actually happened. And if you have determined that something has happened, then taking some quick and appropriate action is important.
Right. And those should be listed out in your policies, right? Is it a warning, reprimand, uh, you know, or fired?
Right.
There's a bunch of different things you can do. You need to be very clear, work with your legal counsel, and Sherm's got great, great advice. Better advice than we could cover in this episode.
Sure, sure. And any of these types of policies, I will mention it's helpful to have an employment attorney look them over if you need to. If you feel like that would give you some more assurance of its defensibility. But definitely some things you want to consider there in terms of corrective actions. You also want to be commensurate or proportional in your response to any kind of incident that happens.
Right. So we just went through this huge gauntlet of behavior you hope you never see.
Yeah.
However, we're talking about it during the Christmas party episode because we've both seen some weird stuff go down, right?
Right.
So, but practically, if you see the person to your left and right start to, maybe get a little drunk and start to act, hey, buddy, we're going to go hang out over here with Carl. Now's not a good time for you to talk to Sandra. You know, you
Right.
can you can head things off before they happen.
Hmm. Right. And this is where you just need to intervene as a bystander. And this can be tricky because a lot of times people don't feel like they should, or they just kind of feel awkward doing it. But I think sometimes you can do it in kind of an oblique manner, kind of like you just mentioned. Like, hey, let's instead of just walking up saying, "Hey, you are out of line," get out of here. I mean, that may be the case. That might be appropriate in some extreme situations. But saying, "Hey, let's go take a walk. Let's I want to chat with you about this thing. Remove someone from the situation. That could be helpful. And realize that, if you catch these things before they start to escalate, you can save people's careers, save a lot of pain and effort for them personally, them professionally, and for the organization overall.
Right. And you're also curating what the norms are, that this is not how
Hmm.
we do work around here. And nobody wants to work in a workplace that's a norm. Only losers, right?
Right,
So,
right. And because yeah, I mean, organizations will become what you tolerate. And when I say you, that's not only people in positions of authority, it's especially people in positions of authority, but it's everyone, right? If you're tolerating certain types of behavior, that starts to become over time the cultural norm. So the way to change that is by, in a way, being a social deviant in that situation and doing something different.
yeah. So Ben, let's move it over to mandatory fun. Um, if you're
Mandatory fun.
right. So if you're the organization, or a leader within that organization, how should we approach these types of social events?
So I think it's a really important topic because many organizations, many leaders, they want to have some sort of social event. They want a holiday party. Maybe it's been something that the organization has done for in years past. They want genuinely to show some appreciation for everyone. Maybe they had a really good year that year. Maybe they just know that everyone's worked hard. They want this to be a good event. The problem is that it can very easily unintentionally turn into a no fun event. And sometimes, the people who organize it, if it's the leaders, they may not even know it, right? Because
Right.
people can be very good at, putting on a mask of, oh, it's a Christmas party. Let's go show up and act like everything's fun. Ha ha. Let's go laugh at the boss's stupid jokes for a while and then get out of here, right? So
Yeah,
you
this
need to
is the
be
part of my career where I get to show the CEO how not in touch he is, with the rest of the organization.
Right, right. And I've come across this in a number of different companies where, the leader has really wanted to do something, and they put something together, and then they think it went really well. And I go talk to some of the people who maybe were there, and it's not that there was like some incident where Bob took his shirt off and started dancing with himself or whatever, or there was some sort of big incident. Like it doesn't have to be something like that happens, but it could be where, yeah, we went and it was just, it was, we didn't want to be there, but we went and we,
I'd
sa-
rather go home and clip my toenails than
yeah,
hang out at this horrible event.
yeah. I think I'd rather go relace my shoes, right?
Right.
So, so I think it's really important that people, especially the leaders in charge in an organization, need to realize that these events can be a powder keg of risk that you have to handle with care. In terms of how you plan them, how you approach them, both from some of the stuff we talked about earlier, the mistletoe and the mishaps, but also from the standpoint that you just don't want something that is just wasting people's time and they think is dumb.
Right. You don't want that to be part of your organizational brand, and you don't wanna be that executive that's viewed as obtusely out of touch with their organization. So that
Right.
that doesn't help you as a leader. So which kinda brings us, like, the military model. The military does pretty good, I think, with
Hmm.
these events. They have dining ins, which is, a formalized event that brings people from the unit, with their partners, to have a dining. The Christmas parties, I know Christmas parties at our unit, we would bring in, um, well, one of the soldiers would get voluntold that they're Santa, and they would ride in on this like 1960s, some kind of convertible, and pull right on into the armory. And the kids would be like, wow, Santa came in a convertible. This would be an opportunity to have good photos as a family, with Santa and some like cheap gifts and that kind of stuff. And then everybody has a buffet and just
Hmm.
sits and socialize. So it could be a good time to bring, well, in the culture of the military, because our spouses hang out with each other when we're deployed, that could be a real positive item.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can be great. And and I think it's important to understand the context here, because a lot of military folks do have children. Actually, I think military families tend to have a few more children on average than civilian families, and so having something that is kid appropriate. So you're not going to have this at 9 o'clock at night. You're going to have this probably during the day sometime, and you're going to have something fun with gifts and so forth, something simple, but then also having some fun stuff for people who don't have children. And that's usually what I see too at these parties is there's some good food. Maybe there's a goofy photo booth where you can put a Santa hat on and get your picture with your buddy or whatever. That kind of stuff, so that you're trying to be inclusive of the different types of people, because it's not like everybody in the military is exactly the same. We all have different life situations to some degree, so making sure that everybody feels like they can have a little bit of fun at the event.
Yeah, and so here's something. So you go to the Christmas party, you make some witty jokes, you're looking really good, you impress the CEO with some kind of mention of a new business opportunity, and then your plus one is throwing up over the balcony. It's like, what is that, like 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, you know?
Or maybe that's the time when you say, I don't know, Mr. or Mrs. CEO. I don't know who that is over there that's throwing up. Gosh, who brought her or
Right.
him? Yeah.
Right. So if you bring your partner, realize that you're bringing somebody into an environment that has potential impact to how your career goes.
Right.
So one of the thing is making sure that attire matches norms. Now, I'm kind of iconoclast. I don't care if somebody's tatted up with blue hair.
Mhm.
Everybody should come, in my view, how they are within certain limits. Like, you don't come in your birthday suit, but short of that, it's fine. But that being said, you can't change the way the world operates. And so, throw a line at one side, your plus one should match the norms. And I think most people get this, except I always see there's always two or three that, it's what's that, Sesame Street? One of these is not like the others.
Mhm. Right.
um, be aware of that.
Yes, yeah. It's funny because in the military, way back when, and this is really seems strange to people today, but officer evaluations actually used to. This is decades and decades and decades ago.
Wow.
Used to include a some sort of evaluation of the person's spouse. Like, is this like is the person's spouse like appropriate officer material as a spouse? And it's pretty horrible sounding now, right? But I think the idea, at least at that time, was that there is like this level of decorum and appropriateness that they were trying to enforce, even though in a very bad way. I don't recommend at all that anyone should include that in their performance appraisals at all. But I think, to your point, making sure that people, kind of know what the norms are and are ready for that situation, because you, as the organizational member, you probably have a good idea of what the norms are, but your partner, your spouse may not, and they don't want to necessarily feel like a total outsider there anyway. So give them a little bit of a heads up of what it's going to be like, and so forth.
Right. And on the other side, if you're a leader and everybody's in a dressed up suit and everything, and somebody comes in and their plus one is completely not out of the norms, but acting appropriately, this is a time that you can reach out and not let that person feel othered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because so much of this is around cultural performance. Some people miss certain cultural cues, and that's fine.
Right.
Are they kind?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so I think as a leader, accepting how people are is definitely important, and you don't want to create a situation at any of these social events where you're making people feel excluded, feeling like they shouldn't be there, because that's really destroying the whole intent of the thing in the first place, right?
Right, and which talking about it 10, if you're the CEO, is this really about, or you're the manager, is this really about your people, or is it about you wanting to feel like like a benevolent dictator?
Yeah, sometimes I get the sense when I talk to CEOs who are, they're like, "Hey Ben, like I'm thinking about, doing something for the folks and so forth." And oftentimes it comes from a very good place, but there are a couple instances that I remember where it kind of seems like they're, acting in this benevolent dictator way where it's more about they really want to bestow their graces upon the peasants as 'tis customary this time of year, right? We will give the scraps from the king's table to the peasants. I just think you really need to ask yourself as the leader, am I trying to do something that for the right reasons? Am I really trying to help people have a good time? Because you know what? Sometimes like a day off of work and just go home and do something and like do holiday stuff with your families, that can be a better gift than doing something together.
Right.
They're like, we've been working our tails off the whole year. We don't really want more time with any of these people. In fact, what we'd like is just a day off,
Yeah, and one of the things is to, as the leader, have your employees determine what's going to be not lame, right?
Mhm.
And you can still have some control over it. Hey guys, I need 3 options for a Christmas party and some, here's maybe some budgetary guidelines.
Right, right. And I think it's important to, have that group of people that's helping you determine what should be done, have that be a representative group. So don't just get the folks from ops to plan it. Don't just get the folks from sales to plan it or whatever. Make sure it's, functionally diverse, maybe have some age diversity, have some other types of diversity in that little task force that you put together so that you can make sure you're representing all those different views. So for example, if everyone just happened to be folks who are married with kids in that group, and yet you also have a number of employees who are single with no kids and none of them are represented, well then you're probably going to come up with some sort of event that might exclude what would be fun for the folks who don't have children, that kind of stuff.
Right, right. But Ben, so there's actually some research around this kind of stuff. What's the research say?
Yeah, so there's, it's interesting because these social events, these holiday parties, and so forth, they can help to strengthen kind of the emotional bonds between people, but it won't necessarily strengthen the bonds across these different uh, groups, right? So, what we find is that um, when you have racial or other types of dissimilarity within a group, the holiday party is probably not going to do a whole lot to make those emotional bonds across groups stronger. It probably will help kind of within group folks feel like they're more connected with each other, but not
Right.
across those groups.
And you
So it
see
won't.
this at big parties,
You
right?
do.
So, if it's a large enterprise organization, everybody kind of clusters with their own little work group or whatever. But if you really, and this is a good thing, want to strengthen bonds across different groups, you need a more varied plan. You know,
Hmm.
okay, well, we're gonna bring people together just once a year. Well, you need something better for that, and a Christmas party is really not the best place to achieve those kind of goals.
Right, right. Yeah, you don't want to have something that you're hoping to get everybody, working together and being more familiar with each other, and just have it be a one-time event. That's not going to really help. So good stuff.
Yeah, and some of this stuff can actually backfire. So
Yeah, certainly can.
So you have the right intentions, you get your employees to plan stuff, and this is why you need to curate it a little bit because depending on how this is executed, you can actually reinforce those fault lines within a team and between teams, right?
Hmm.
So,
Great. So, today, we talked about a lot of different things, but, focusing on mistletoe mishaps and mandatory fun at work. Today we talked about these holiday parties, other social events, and how they really can go wild. So keep that in mind as you're starting to plan stuff in your organization. We talked about office romance, fraternization, harassment, and some great ways that organizations can kind of get ahead of these types of things, a better way forward for them. And then we talked about this idea of mandatory fun and how leaders, how organizations should approach social events in a better way.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.